My name is Chris Stefano. I'm with the Mineralogical Record, and welcome to our podcast on the Mineral Nation YouTube channel. I'm here today with Evan Jones. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me, Evan.
Sure, no problem.
What we wanted to do with this was to talk to some of the authors about what went into creating some of the more iconic content in the Mineralogical Record. And one of the more recent articles that has been a huge splash was the article that you wrote with Peter Megaw on the Milpillas Mine in Mexico. We have the issue here with a wonderful Milpillas azurite on the cover. If you don't have it, you need to find it and get a copy because it is an absolutely wonderful article. Researched to the nth degree. Evan did an amazing job with it. It is.
Well, thank you.
It is just outstanding. This leads very nicely into the big question, I guess, which is why Milpillas? What got you thinking about that? You're really an Arizona guy, and here we are in Mexico. So how'd that happen?
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, being born and raised in Arizona, in a family of mineral collectors. In other words, my father, he was the collector of the house. You know, when I was a child, you know, Arizona is so close to Mexico that we would see a lot of Mexican minerals coming across the border into Arizona to the hands of dealers in Tucson and Phoenix.
Sure.
And so naturally, my father's collection had not only a lot of Arizona things in it, but a lot of things from Mexico. So I was always aware of minerals from various Mexican localities, and it, you know, because of that, became one of my favorite sources for specimens. And for a time, you know, later on as I got older, collecting Mexican minerals was one of my specialties. Although it's not a specialty now, I only collect Arizona minerals on a personal level today. So you know, when I became a mineral dealer full time back in the late '80s, it was only natural that I would be interested in buying and selling Mexican minerals. Not only because I could, at that time, you know, put pieces in my collection, but, you know, these were places that were of great interest to me. And then, you know, later on when the Milpillas mine opened and we started seeing specimens from there, I naturally was greatly interested in this.
And so you started handling a lot of Milpillas material?
It's interesting how it all started because I was not the first dealer to have minerals from Milpillas. I think that honor might go to Gene Schlepp. He was the first person that I knew of that had a few pieces. We didn't know where they were coming from. I'm not sure that he knew. The first specimens I saw, which would have been about 2006, I think, which is not long after the mine opened for production.
Sure.
I think they were labeled Zacatecas. Nobody seemed to know where they were coming from. And a little bit later, maybe it was 2007, a friend of mine acquired a batch of malachite pseudomorphs. And he thought that they were from somewhere in Sonora. So I did a little investigating, and I think it was Dennis Beals I spoke with, and asking, do you know anything about this stuff that's coming from Mexico, these copper minerals? And he said, oh, that's the Milpillas mine. Well, then the cat was out of the bag, and everyone started talking about the Milpillas mine. So I contacted my buddy that had these pseudomorphs and ended up buying the bulk of what he had left, and that kind of got me started with Milpillas. I was working at a rock shop part-time in Scottsdale, just helping out some friends, and I got a call from Jimmy Vacek, who's a dealer in Scottsdale who does mostly lapidary stuff, but some minerals. And he called me up and said, hey, I met this guy, and he's got a little box of azurite crystals from Milpillas, this new place, and I'm going to send them over to you. You know, I bought a couple pieces, I'm going to send them to you. And I thought, oh, hey, great, I'll take a look at these things. Well, this turned out to be a fellow by the name of Jesus Valenzuela.
Okay.
And he shows up, and he's got a little cigar box with these little crystal plates of azurite And wow, these are great. So I bought these things, and nowadays everyone knows the Valenzuela as one of the major sources of Milpillas minerals. And,
Right.
But that's when I was one of the first people to meet him and get started.
So that was the origin of Valenzuela, when he figured out that, oh, I can really make money with these things.
I tell you, he was it was a quick learning curve for him. I mean, within a year he was selling amazing stuff from Milpillas, and we were lucky enough to handle, over the years, a large portion of production from him and from others down in Sonora. So it's been quite a ride.
So you got the idea to write the article from handling so many specimens and just really enjoying working with them.
Yeah, the genesis of the article for me really started with I was asked to give a talk. I guess it was at one of Rob's Dallas symposiums, and to give a talk on Milpillas, since I'd handled so much of it, and I was kind of keeping track of what was coming out, when it was, just on a personal level, what was coming out, when it was found, what level, if I could figure it out.
Basically for your own edification.
Yeah, just for my own edification, and plus to label these things properly.
Sure.
I thought, well, I could probably put together a talk, Rob, no problem. One thing led to another, and it was going to be a short talk, but I ended up, putting all this material together for this talk, and it looked pretty good. And that really became the seed for the idea of, hey, this really should be an article. And then that's when I started talking to Peter about it, and he said, hey, let's do this, So we took what information that I had and combined it with the information that he had, and that really became the article. It took, a few years to put it all together, to get it to where it, where we felt comfortable enough that we're ready to publish.
This is something that a lot of people don't always appreciate when they open their mineralogical record and page through these beautiful articles. Is the time and effort it takes to put together something on the scale of a Milpillas article. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you had to kind of overcome to get it together and make it work?
There was a little bit of pushing and pulling from the editorial department of the magazine between them and the authors, us. Hey, we want this article. Well, and our position was, can we wait a little bit longer, because there's more stuff coming out, and we're documenting it as it comes out.
Right.
Okay, well, let's wait. And then a year or two goes by, more material is coming out. We're building on what we've written already, adding new stuff, and we wanted to wait until production slowed enough to where we felt it was a good end point for the descriptive mineralogy of the article. And another thing was, we really wanted it to be a one article issue, because the locality is such a world-class specimen producing location that we felt it deserved a single issue. So it was decided. We didn't think it was long enough, and Wendell wasn't sure, so we thought, well, hey, let's just throw in a whole bunch of pictures and make it a
fatten it up.
Yeah, fatten it up a little bit, because I think originally,
I don't think anybody's going to complain.
Right. I mean, originally I think it was going to be part of a Mexico issue with 2 or 3 articles. That was the original plan. But then it got so big, and then we thought, let's just it should be a single issue article. So beef it up with lots of pictures, which everybody loves.
Yep.
And Wendell thought that was a great idea, and that's where it ended up.
So, you guys got a ton of photos for this, and it just looks amazing. And I'm going to ask you kind of a tough question now, and that's, so of all of that, can you point to a favorite image that you were able to acquire while you were preparing this article?
Yeah, that is a tough one. We drew on a lot of sources, many photographers, many collections, and And I got to say that they all stepped up and provided a lot of great images for this issue. It was very tough. We dumped, I don't know how many hundreds of photos, well, maybe not hundreds, but many, many, many photos on Wendell, and he carefully selected through them the ones that he wanted to use, and he did a great job. So yeah, there is one that actually comes to mind, and let's see, I think we've got it right here. And it's going to be this one, this cuprite in the upper left corner. And cuprite is one of my favorite mineral species. I just love cuprite.
When they're good, they're so good.
Yeah, I love the color. I love isometric minerals, period. I love copper minerals, period. So, it's got everything going for it. But this specimen, it's a thumbnail, but it really took a great image. And just look at the architecture of this thumbnail. You've got these two perfect cubes and this little interesting bridge that connects them. I think this specimen is nicknamed the cherries because it does look like a couple of cherries on a stem. So yeah, that's the one I'll pick. There are many, many photos I could point to as my favorite.
You brought up about how you're writing about a locality that is not a historical locality, but one that still exists and is still continuing to produce.
Yeah.
And so at what point does one make the call, yes, now it's time to write the article, the locality is mature enough,
Yeah.
And there's always the risk, as has happened with Milpillas, that it has continued to produce, and there's some new things that have come since the article was produced that weren't documented. But at some point, you do just have to bite the bullet and publish.
Correct, and and that was just part of the discussion.
Are you happy with making the decision to do it when you did?
Yeah, I think it was the perfect place to stop because I think not long after publication, the mine closed temporarily.
Right.
Mainly due to COVID. We always knew that the mine was going to shut down at some point. Peter knew from reports coming out of Mexico, and plus he knew from his being acquainted with corporate guys at Milpillas that at some point they were going to run out of reserves, and the mine was going to, so it had a projected mine life. It was
right,
going
of course.
to, they had enough reserves to go to, I think it was first to 2013. Then they extended it to 2017. So we knew it was going to close at some point. But what really got it shut down was COVID. So it closed for 2 or 3 years, and then they were able to actually reopen just a couple, 2 or 3 years ago. So that would have been like 2022, I think they reopened.
Right.
After closure, and we've seen some new things since then.
Yeah, a couple of spectacular things even.
Yeah, and I think we're probably going to want to write a part 2.
At least a short update, right?
Yeah, or an update. Yeah.
We'll be looking forward to that.
Yes. Specimen production is slower than it was before. In the early days of the mine, they were mining oxide ore bodies that were very specimen rich. So there was just production. At certain points we were seeing new azurites coming out every week or two. It was for months. It was pretty amazing.
One of the reasons that Wendell was so excited to get the Milpillas article and was so happy when you and Peter put that together is that the azurites from there are truly world class.
Yeah.
And so can you say something about kind of where they fit in worldwide as a species?
Sure. Well, most people now will agree that the azurites from Milpillas are among the world's finest, if not the world's finest. Simply based on the quality, the variety of crystal habits, association with other minerals, their attractiveness, and that's something that I wanted to point out about Milpillas, the Milpillas mine in general, is that mineral specimens from Milpillas tend to be very high quality. They tend to come out of the ground, very clean. They don't need a lot of prep work other than trimming. They're not coated with ugly oxide minerals that need to be removed, like iron staining and so on and so forth. And I think we touched on that a little bit in the article. But if you need to stop and think about, well, why is that? And I believe what we've come up with is that this is a porphyry copper deposit that was buried very deeply under many meters of gravels, and the original oxidation events that created these secondary copper minerals kind of got arrested at a certain point. So groundwater wasn't able to penetrate these ore bodies and in a sense, ruin the crystals or coat them, etch them, alter them in some way. So everything that comes out of Milpillas is really beautiful, really lustrous, really clean, by and large. And that, to me, that's really fascinating. I think the Tsumeb mine was real similar. You had the second oxide zone, that there's this fault, and here's this oxide zone that's down dropped really deep, and everything was preserved really well from attack by surface waters and acidic fluids and that sort of thing.
You make a good point about Milpillas. I was talking about the azurites being world class, but many localities you expect you get one or two species that are really world class, and everything else is like, oh well, there's some nice XYZ or whatever. Yeah. But there's really only one or two species that everybody's going, yeah, that's world class. But Milpillas has had half a dozen finds of world-class examples of a variety of species.
Yeah, in some cases they are the best in the world, like the brochentites.
The brochentites, right.
Bar none the finest brochentites ever found anywhere.
Right. Volberthites, finest in the world.
Finest ever. So you've got a group of these things that are among the best, if not the world's best examples for the species. The porphyry deposit that where Milpillas is, it's very, I mentioned that it was buried deeply, so it had no surface exposure. Most of these other mines were surface outcrops.
Right.
And so it was discovered very late in the history of the district. I don't think they drilled into the deposit until like the 1980s. And again, that's because it was buried so deeply. There was no surface expression to this.
Right. So unlike so many of these other southern Arizona, northern Mexico porphyries, they were found 100 years ago or more.
Yeah. And since they were right on the surface, there was a lot of oxidation and different things alteration that happened. The other thing that's happened recently is we're starting to see some secondary lead minerals, which has been unheard of for the first 15 years of specimen production. It's all copper minerals, and with no other minerals, no base metal specimens, no zinc, no lead, no molybdenum, some of the other things that you would expect to see in a copper porphyry.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, whatever ore body they're working, which is going to be primarily a sulfide ore body, because that's what they're mining right now.
Right.
Are the sulfides, copper sulfides. There must have been some lead in there somewhere, some galena or something that's. So you've got these secondary.
So can you talk about some of the things you're seeing? I know you showed me some amazing mimetite specimens in Denver.
Yeah, the mimetites are really something. I mean, that's completely unexpected for this mine. The quality is right up there with Tsumeb gem pocket mimetites from the early 70s.
Yeah, the two you showed me in Denver certainly are really close to that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what other species are you seeing in this section so far?
We've seen anglesite, we've seen cerussite, and we've seen wolfenite.
Wonderful.
They're very tiny, but wolfenites nonetheless. And who knows?
So far, the mimetites are the only ones that are really outstanding.
I would say so. Yeah. Okay. The anglesites are pretty decent, but they're respectable, but
not exciting yet.
Not super exciting, but it's Milpillas because so anything can happen.
And it seems like they've just gotten into this area that's producing these things, so it could get good.
Yeah, and I don't know the extent of it, but it's really exciting that we're seeing these things.
That's great, yeah, and boy, I just can't wait for that update, but it sounds like we really need to wait for the update a little bit longer.
The other thing that's really interesting is for some reason this deposit had a lot of vanadium in it, so really interesting suite of vanadate species were found: volborthite, turanite, vesiniaite, and a couple of others.
Right, and it's entirely possible there could be more of those things in this deeper area.
Yeah, and so there must be a little molybdenum as well, because now that we're seeing some wolfenite.
Yeah.
So very interesting copper porphyry, very different from most of the others in the Southwest and really in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, the bulk chemistry must be somewhat similar, but definitely you're getting a different suite of minerals and a different appearance than is typical. Compare it to Bisbee or some of the other Southwestern porphyries, and on the surface, the suite looks similar, but there's some very important differences with Milpillas that really set it apart. And you've talked a little bit about that, and there's more details in your article.
Yeah, the only specimen-producing porphyry that I can think of where the crystallography and the mineralogy and even the host rock, the geology reminds me of Milpillas is the New Cornelia mine in Ajo. Okay. Some of that stuff looks really similar to Milpillas, or well, vice versa, because Milpillas is newer. So some of the Milpillas stuff looks a lot like old Ajo specimens.
And that's a locality that doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of material preserved, it seems like.
Yeah, the mine closed in, I think, 1983. Mm-hmm.
So you almost never see things from there.
Not too much anymore.
So going back to putting the article together, obviously this was a very time-consuming process, and it's quite labor-intensive, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about some of the parts of the process that were most fun for you, and maybe then it would be good to segue into what were some of the biggest challenges to getting it done, and having something that you could be proud of in the end?
Well, I never considered myself a writer, really. I mean, my father, most people know Bob Jones, and he's produced hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on minerals over many decades, and writing comes very natural to him.
Right.
It does not come natural to me. and
yet you pulled it off.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, it started out as a talk.
Right.
And I'm really kind of OCD about things when it comes to writing things down. And so I was really, meticulous about getting the talk right, and that kind of carried over to the article. So, it took a long time to put it together and to get it to where I was very happy with it. Some of the parts that were most exciting to me that I really enjoyed was just figuring out the sequence of how to write everything down and what made the most sense as far as telling the story.
Sure.
I would write a few paragraphs and then, think about it for a few days. I'd look at it again and then sleep on it and then change some things around. It doesn't happen over, immediately. It's a process. And
finding that narrative is not always easy.
Yeah, it's not for me. So it really took months, if not years, to get it all to where I was happy with it. And Peter did a great job on his section. He wrote all the geology section. Was his main part of it, and he's a fantastic writer, great author. So it was a real pleasure working with him. Some of my favorite parts of the article that really was a lot of fun for me was, I was kind of keeping track of the different pockets of primarily azurite, but a few other things as they were coming out. And some of the pockets were named by our suppliers, some of the pockets we named, being the ones that were selling the specimens.
Mm-hmm.
So I was keeping track of that. That was a lot of fun to keep track of when each pocket came out, and the name of the pocket and what level they were coming from. And one of the difficulties, though, was so many specimens, and again, primarily of azurite, so many azurite specimens came from Milpillas that didn't come from what was obviously a large, major find that had, hundreds or dozens of specimens.
Right.
So one thing that I run into all the time is, hey, Evan, you wrote this article. You kept track of all the pockets. Where's my specimen from? Which pocket is it? Is it this one? And I have to tell them, well, gosh, maybe 2/3 of the azurites that came out of this mine aren't from a named pocket.
Yeah, they're from minor occurrences.
They're just from minor occurrences, and they may look like one of the major pockets, but see, we couldn't, since we weren't there collecting the stuff, we couldn't really keep track of it that closely.
Right,
so
and not every pocket deserves a name.
Well, not every pocket deserves the name. Only the ones that were very distinctive. There were a lot of specimens produced that we could identify on our end.
Yep.
Up here as being from the same, obviously from the same find. Those were named.
Right.
So that was a very interesting and exciting project.
Were there any challenges that you hadn't anticipated?
I guess one of the biggest challenges was getting accurate information.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't really contact the mining company.
Sure.
For some of this information, so we had to work through channels, through supply channels, to try to get accurate information as far as levels, dates, where some of these specimens came from, to add to the notes that we had already made.
Sure.
So that was a challenge.
Yeah. So you're oftentimes working with third or fourth hand information and trying to organize that in a way that made sense.
we didn't have mine maps, for example.
Right.
We didn't have access to those, so we had to work off descriptions from people that were there and that worked there, or new people that worked there, and second and third hand information. So but we think everything's pretty accurate.
It's often an imperfect process, especially when the mining companies are unfortunately not terribly friendly to mineral collecting.
Right, and it's not like we're using, going back in history and using references and documentation that's
right.
from the literature.
Yeah, all the mine maps are proprietary until the mine is gone, then eventually they'll become available.
Yeah.
But for the time being, we can't work with that information.
Correct.
You've pulled off this amazing article. It just looks amazing.
Thanks.
And it looks like there'll be more in the future. But so you've got some experience now. Do you have any advice for people who would like to write something in the future for us? Yeah,
sure. Well, this was actually the second article I'd written for MinRec, and since I'd never written for the Mineralogical Record before, I wasn't quite sure how to approach it. So I thought, well, the easiest thing to do is just look at past articles, look at the format, see how other people have written their articles for MinRec, and just follow that formula. And I picked articles that I really liked, because there does seem to be a general pattern to articles. Introduction, geology, mine history, descriptive mineralogy. And
sure, don't reinvent the wheel. Run with the format that already exists.
And that's how I thought. Okay, I'm just going to write my article like that, and it worked out. But again, like I said earlier, I'm a little meticulous about my writing. I want everything to be just so, and it's a long process for me. Months, if not a couple years, to get a good article written. And of course, you need time to draw on different sources and get your photographs taken and captions written. And
that's right.
So,
don't try to get it done overnight, because
don't force it. I would say to people, just do it at your own pace. If you need to take a break from it for a couple weeks, just take a break.
You'll be happier with the final result.
Go back to it, and you know, you'll see new things. You know, you'll read what you wrote 2 weeks ago, and oh, you know, it would, you know, I forgot to put this in there, and you know, this paragraph actually really makes more sense if I put it before, you know, this other paragraph, because then it flows better and it makes more sense. The story is easier to understand.
Right.
So those are some of the bits of wisdom that I can throw out there for other people that might want to do something like this.
Thanks for that.
Sure. The Mineralogical Record is an indispensable a set of, you know, references for any collector's library. It's a must-have. You've got to have every issue because there's so much there. And I go back and look at issues all the time, you know, and you can use the various indices that you guys have published, you and Tom Moore and so on. But if I had to pick a single issue that I use more than any other as a reference, it would be Dick Graham's wonderful Bisbee article that I think is the Arizona 3 issue from 1983, is it?
Something like that. It was in the early 80s.
But
and
I
you
mean,
don't find that to be dated?
No, because I mean, he did such a thorough job at the time. Now he has since published, you know, other things that add to what he had done back then. But to this day, I still, you know, my copy is worn. It's dog-eared. You know, I look at it all the time because as an Arizona mineral collector, with Bisbee being probably the most important specimen producing locality, well, definitely the most important specimen producing locality in Arizona. You know, it forms a large portion of my collection. And when I'm researching specimens, I always go back to that article to look up the you know, the wonderful documentation and historical information that Dick Graham had put into the article, which, you know, it's as good today as it was in 1983.
Yeah. So even 40 years later, it has maintained its place as an important reference.
Yeah, and it's not just that issue. I think it's every issue.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, a lot of issues contain articles about species and localities that, you know, aren't high on my interest list. But if I need to, you know, research something, there's probably an article about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and if there isn't, that's a great place to think about. Well, I could write this one.
Right. You know, we've got many articles, I'm sure, coming in the pipeline for Mineralogical Record, and you know, there's no other publication like it in the world, in my opinion.
I mean, you know, when Wendell took over the Mineralogical Record, you know, he told me, in his mind, the whole point of it was to produce articles that could be used as references long term. And he put a lot of his time and effort into making sure of that, and that is what we continue to do today. And your article stands as an excellent example of that, where this is going to be a valuable reference far into the future, long after, you know, most other magazines have become irrelevant. And
well, thank you.
So thank you for contributing to that project.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge again my co-author, Peter Megaw, who, you know, he did a great job on his section. You know, I worked on my sections real hard, and then you know, all the photography came together, and then you guys, Wendell did a great layout. It's a very wonderful issue that we're very pleased with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Evan.
Sure thing. I hope I can write something else for you guys again in the future.